I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at the progressive movement. Today we'll be focusing in on the causes of progressivism, comparing it to the populist movement that you'd looked at previously. We'll look at the role of journalists and novelists and what roles they played in the progressive movement. We'll evaluate some of the social reforms that the progressives tackled. We'll explain why progressives what they hope to achieve through political reform. As I go through this, you should fill out your focus questions that are posted in Google Classroom. I do suggest that you have like a split screen, or if you have the opportunity to play this video lesson on a YouTube device, let's say on a Roku or Amazon Fire streaming stick, whatever it might be. That way you could watch it on a bigger screen and you can kind of type in your answers as you move along on your Chromebook. Whatever works best for you. All right, so as we go through it, I'll read through some of the questions, kind of discuss the topics with you. If I ever go too quickly, you could always pause if you need to take some more time to write things down. And if you have any questions along the way, just post a question to me in Google Comments to the sidebar of your Google document, and I'll address that as quickly as possible, usually within a minute or two. All right, so why was the progressive movement started in the late 1800s? It began in response to a lot of the negative things during this period of time. Things like industrialization, factories, the overcrowdedness of the factory workers, urbanization, the growth and expansion of cities, and an influx of immigrants that were coming into the cities in the late 1800s. When we think about the progressive movement in terms of where they got their support from, wide variety of different political parties, social classes, ethnic groups, and religions, in particular the growing middle class, those who are working in factories, dissatisfied industrial workers, and wealthy Americans kind of driven by a desire to act for the good of society. So your philanthropists or your wealthy business owners who were kind of concerned about the common folk. One of the biggest things that progressives did is they fought for reforms. And anytime you see the word reform, it's usually referencing something they want to bring a positive change to. This included permanent change. And when you think about permanent change, the only way to bring about permanent change are changes in laws. You can have Congress act to pass a new bill or law to help out within society. You can sue or file a lawsuit in the court system, and if the Supreme Court takes it up, they can officially pass a reform or law. And of course, you have state laws and local township ordinances or laws that can all work to protect the common folk. When you think about progressives and what they were seeing within society during the late 1800s, they saw a lot of corruption. We saw this a little bit in the previous chapter. We saw the political boss system and political machines that dominated society during that period of time, almost like a pay-to-play type of situation where you had to really report first to the party boss, Boss Tweed from New York City. And if you wanted to get a job or run for office, you really had to go through Boss Tweed in New York City in order to do so. During this period of time, they were fighting for social justice and reform. Women, of course, still did not have the right to vote in the late 1800s. It wouldn't be until 1920 that women would finally get the opportunity and the right to vote. Also, child labor laws. If you were living in 1890 and you were 14, 15 years of age, 16, you'd be most likely working in a factory. Compare and contrast progressivism to populism during the 1800s. So we basically have both sides, and then we'll see where they had some commonalities or things that they shared in common. So populism, they really drew a lot of their support. You remember the farmers and the grains, the movement there for farmers, especially during the late 1800s, where farm prices were going down and the profits weren't really something that farmers are enjoying. A lot of their new equipment and seed technology was very expensive, so farmers were really struggling in the late 18 and early 1900s. Populists, they fought for free silver. Progressives, they drew their support from the middle class. A lot of people who were concerned about their children, about themselves working in factories. They focused on the bad conditions in cities. And in general, both fought for the workers' rights and against government corruption. When you think about women, of course, women are going to fight for the right to vote. You see a couple of photographs there. The one on the left, votes for women, basically saying they should have the right to vote. Right photo, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty, meaning the same freedoms that men enjoyed? Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? So this is in the earlier 1900s, these photographs. When you think about reforms in cities during this period of time, something that we kind of just take for granted within society, paved streets. When you look at paved streets, obviously paved streets are important because previous to that, streets were made out of dirt. And when it rained, what happens to dirt? Logically, it turns to mud. That made it very difficult to move around, especially during the late 1800s. You were going by horse, or later on, the earliest automobiles in the late 18 and the earlier 1900s. You'd get stuck, and it'd be very difficult and messy to get around. Safe drinking water. Obviously, you have clean water coming out of your faucets in your homes today, something that people 120 years ago were really not enjoying. Decent housing for those of you who went to the tenement trip we had back in March. We obviously saw the very small, tight conditions that families of 4, 6, or 8 had to live in. And adequate municipal services, meaning that today we have like garbage pickup and township plows the roads. Well, we don't get snow anymore, but if we did still get snow, they would take care of things like that. Wealthy industrialists built huge companies and they limited competition, many of them often getting a monopoly on their particular area of interest. So look at the pros and the cons of big business during this period of time. Big companies produce goods more efficiently, therefore consumers can buy them at lower prices. However, some feared that the government or regulation would hurt these efficiencies and the economy. Cons of big business, middle-class progressives wanted to bust the trust, meaning the trust would be the companies that in collaboration to control a particular industry. They wanted to create more opportunities for smaller businesses. Progressives complained that the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was inadequate and ineffective in limiting the abuses of big businesses. Next, we'll look at the Muckrakers, and there's a visual image there. That's actually a cartoon. That's President Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s. He's the one that kind of coined the term muckraker. And you can see across his rake that's in his hand there, it says investigation. Muckrakers are trying to rake through and kind of filter out the filth within society or find issues or problems within society. So socially conscious and investigative journalists and other writers were the ones who wrote magazine articles, newspaper articles that kind of called for reform within society. As I indicated, Teddy Roosevelt called these writers muckrakers because he thought he thought they were fascinated with the ugliest side of society. A muckrake during that period of time cleaned manure and hay out of animal stables. So if you want to get rid of the filth within society, muckrakers did the investigation and they tried to clean up society. Writers were angry at first, but over the course of time, they kind of took that nickname as a badge of honor. You can see there what Roosevelt is raking there is the meat scandal. We'll learn later on that during the late 1800s and early 1900s, for example, chopped meat, what they would do is they would take the meat and it would end up getting pushed into like a meat grinder. And very often there was a lot of filth mixed in with the meat. And that was kind of the scandal that broke out. And that's why today with the Meat Inspection Act that was passed during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, that's why we have different grades of meat, different percentages of meat, which are, more fine. The higher the percent of pure meat, the more expensive it is. How did muckrakers impact society? Their articles in magazines and newspapers entered the homes of millions of Americans. People across the nation became horrified about the conditions that their muckrakers revealed. Muckrakers' accounts prompted Americans to push for reforms to correct the ills within society. One of the leading muckrakers at the time was Lincoln Steffens. He was the managing editor at McClure's, a magazine known for uncovering social problems. In 1903, he published The Shame of Cities, which was a collection of articles both on political corruption and flaws within city systems. He showed how corrupt politicians won elections by bribing and threatening voters, and revealed how political corruption had impacted different aspects of lives in cities. The excerpt below is from McClure's magazine, Corruption and Reform in St. Louis. How would you describe Lincoln Steffens' writing style? What language seems especially provocative? The visitor to St. Louis is told of the wealth of the residents, of the financial strength of the banks, and of the growing importance of the industries. Yet he sees poorly paved, refuse-burdened streets and dusty or mud-covered alleys. He passes a ramshackle fire trap crowded with sticks, with the sick, and learns that in City Hospital. Finally, he turns a tap in the hotel to see liquid mud flowing into the wash basin or bathtub. This is in 1902, an article on St. Louis in McClure's magazine. He used strong emotional language that helps the reader imagine the conditions. For example, he refers to the refuge-burdened streets and calls the hospital a ramshackle fire trap crowded with the sick. Another influential muckraker at the time, apologize for that, was Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis, he was a photographer for the New England Sun newspaper. Riis turned his camera on the crowded, unsafe, rat-infested tenement buildings where the urban poor lived. Between 1890 and 1903, he published several works called How the Other Half Lives. Riis has turned his camera into almost a way for Americans to see what was going on. He published several works during that period of time. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, in that he wrote about the despair of immigrants working in Chicago stockyards, revealed the unsanitary conditions in the industry. This eventually prompted regulations to promote and protect food safety. You can see just the cloud of pollution during this period of time in history, too. 15. Which reform movements were positively impacted by the work of the muckrakers? They promoted laws to improve living conditions, public health in schools. They urged government to regulate businesses. One person who was influential during this period of time as well was Walter Rauschenbusch. He wrote The Social Gospel. He thought that Christianity should be the basis of social reform, meaning that religion teaches, helping your neighbor out and doing good things. So he thought this might be a good way to help within society. By following biblical teachings about charity and justice, he explained people can make society the kingdom of God. That is, make life on earth closer to the promised paradise of heaven by helping others and making the world more just. So in many ways, his social gospel was simply helping out your neighbors. 17, how did settlement houses help the poor? These were community centers that provided social services to the urban poor. Most settlement houses were privately funded and run by volunteers. Settlement house workers gave mothers classes in childcare, taught the immigrants who came into the country English. They ran nursery schools and kindergartens. They also provided theater, art, and dance programs for adults. Perhaps the most famous of the settlement house organizers was Jane Addams. In 1889, Addams opened the Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago. Over the years, the Hull House grew to include 13 separate buildings. Through her programs, Addams made significant social and economic contributions to the lives of the people living in the poorest of Chicago neighborhoods. 19, why do you think that many social workers in the late 1800s were college educated and middle-class women? Many progressives were from the middle class, and they communicated through essays and photographs. They were aimed towards people with a college education. At the time, many other professions were not open to women, even those with an education. So their career paths were somewhat limited. So a lot of them kind of flocked to this particular position as a social worker. What role did Christianity play in the progressive movement? Many organizations promoted Christian values as part of their mission to help the poor. For example, we had mentioned before with the social gospel, which urged people to make life on earth closer to life in heaven. Many churches promoted a shorter work week, condemned child labor on the grounds of strengthening family values. The YMCA was founded to spread Christian values. 21, the progressive era brought changes in how people thought about children's education. Do you think children should go to school to prepare them to be good workers or to learn how to think creatively? Children need to learn how to think creatively because this is necessary for many jobs as well as for other parts of lives. Practical skills like carpentry and cooking are also important and should be taught in school. These views are very similar to John Dewey's, who was a leading advocate for education. 22, what issues with factories did the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire bring to light? During the fire, workers were unable to escape because exit doors were locked. The factory was poorly ventilated, so the fire got out of control. This tragedy led to regulations that made workplaces safer and easier to escape in case of emergencies. It also demonstrated how businesses were taking advantage of poor workers, in some cases even threatening their lives and their health. Okay. 23. Why did Galveston, Texas replace its city government with a commission system? Commission governments like the one in Galveston were more efficient and were not as easily manipulated by political and business interests. Commission, instead of having one person lead, it's a group of people. The commission, too, worked on the cost of gas, electricity, and water, all of which went down because the government used public utilities opposed to private for profit. Many cities now adopted this new model of government. One thing that we saw recently play out where Joe Biden ended up being the nominee for the Democratic Party, or at least the presumptive nominee, we saw when we were still back in school during regular learning periods of time. We saw a wide variety of candidates who were running for the Democratic nomination, and they were voting in what is called a primary. Primary is an election when citizens vote to select nominees for an upcoming election. So the Democrats basically chose Joe Biden to take on President Trump in the 2020 presidential election. By 1916, all but 4 states had direct primaries, and we have primaries not just for the presidency, but for Senate seats. Let's say, there's 5 different candidates who want the Democratic or Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate. So in the primaries, you get to vote which candidate you'd like to represent your political party in a Senate race or House of Reps or whatever it might be. 25, progressives wanted to make sure that elected officials would follow citizens' wishes. To achieve this goal, they worked for 3 other political reforms: the initiative, the referendum, and recall. And I'll identify each of those for you. An initiative gives people the power to put a proposed new law directly on the ballot. So let's say, for example, they want to legalize marijuana in New Jersey. They could potentially put that on the ballot. You could vote for it, and then that could become a new law. Referendum, this allows for citizens to approve or reject laws passed by a legislature. So, for example, let's say Metuchen wants to spend an extra $15 million refurbishing classrooms and adding on to buildings throughout the township. Well, they could put the referendum on the ballot, let's say in 2021 at this point in time, or 22. And then the township residents can approve the additional expenditures, which would increase taxes for themselves, but would improve schools along the way, or they could reject it through the referendum. Recall, let's say you're unhappy with Governor Murphy and you like a different governor, but you don't want to wait until his term is up. You can potentially get a petition going, get a certain number of signatures. New Jersey, probably something like 100,000 signatures or more. present that to the state government, and then they would have a recall election sometime between now and 2021 when his term is up. If it's really close to the end of his term, it's very unlikely you would get a recall election in place. So usually when you recall a governor or a position in an elective office, they probably have to have at least half their term left. If not, you just have to wait pretty much to the next election, because once the signatures are in place, the recall election doesn't take place like the next day. It takes some time to go through the process and prep for it. Explain in your own words why some people oppose direct election of senators, which was established by the 17th Amendment. Some people believe that a reform would weaken state governments and give less power to block changes by the federal government. When senators were elected by state governments, they were motivated to do what the state governments wanted them to do. And the final one here, the lesson reflection. What were some of the accomplishments of the progressive movement? More power and voices for the people, improved conditions in cities, additional laws protecting citizens and workers, eventually the right to vote for women, and direct impacts on the political process. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion here on the progressive movement. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.